Chapter 2. All the way from Ramallah to Jerusalem to Haifa he and talked about everything, without stopping for a moment. But when he reached the entrance to Bat Galim, silence bound his tongue. Here he was in Haifa, listening to the sound his car wheels always made when they turned. The furious beating of his agitated heart made him lose himself. From time to time, 20 years of absence had dwindled away. And suddenly, incredibly, things were right back to where they had been, despite all reason and logic. What could he be looking for? A week ago, in their house in Ramallah, Sophia had said to him, "Hey, going everywhere now. Why don't we go to Haifa?" He was having dinner at the time. He saw his hand stop involuntarily between the plate and his mouth. He looked at her after a moment and saw her turn away so he wouldn't be able to read anything in her eyes. Then he said to her, "Go to Haifa." "Why?" Her voice was soft. "To see our house." "Just to see it." He placed the bite of food back on his plate, got up and stood in front of her. She held her head low against her chest, like someone confessing to an unexpected sin. He placed his fingers under her chin and raised her head to look into her eyes, which were moist with tears. Compassionately, he asked her, "Sophia, what are you thinking about?" She nodded her head in agreement without speaking, for she knew that he knew. Perhaps he too was thinking about it all along, but was waiting for her to bring it up, so she wouldn't feel, as she always did, as though she had been the one at fault for the catastrophe that had occurred in both of their hearts. He whispered hoarsely, "Khaldun." All at once that name which had remained unspoken for so many years was out in the open. The few times they had spoken of the child they always said him. They avoided giving any of their other 3 sons that name, although they called the eldest Khalid, and the daughter who followed a year and a half later, Khalida. Said himself was called Abu Khalid. 8 and old friends who knew what happened all agreed to say that Khaldun had died. How could the past come rushing in now by the back door in such an extraordinary way? Said remained standing as though asleep someplace far away. After a while he came to himself and strode back to his place. Before he sat down he said, "Delusions, Sophia, delusions. Don't deceive yourself so tragically. You know how we questioned and investigated. You know the stories of the Red Cross and the peacekeeping forces. And the foreign friends we sent there. No, I don't want to go to Haifa. It's a disgrace. If it's a disgrace for the people of Haifa, for you and me it's a double disgrace. Why torture ourselves?" Her sobbing grew louder, but she didn't say anything. They passed the night without a word, listening to the sound of soldiers' boots striking the road and to the radio still giving the news. When he went to bed he knew in his heart that there was no escape. The thought lurking there for 20 years had finally come to light, and there was no way to bury it again. Even though he knew that his wife wasn't asleep, that she, too, was thinking about the same thing all night long, he didn't speak to her. In the morning she said to him quietly, "If you want to go, take me with you." Said, "Don't try to go alone." He knew Sophia well, he knew the way she could sense every thought that went through his mind. Once again she had stopped him in his tracks. During the night he had decided to go alone, and here she had uncovered his decision instinctively and forbidden it. It remained hanging over them, day and night, for a week. They ate it with their food and slept with it, but they did not speak a word about it. Then, just last night, he said to her. Let's go to Haifa tomorrow. At least take a look. Maybe we can pass near our house. I think they're going to issue an order prohibiting it soon. Their calculations were wrong. He was quiet for a moment. He wasn't sure whether he wanted to change the subject, but he heard himself continue. In Jerusalem and Nablus and here people talk every day about their visits to Jaffa, Acre, Tel Aviv, Haifa, Safed, towns in Galilee and in Muphalath.9 they all tell the same story. It seems that what they saw with their own eyes didn't measure up to their speculations. Most of them bring back stories of failure. Apparently, the miracle the Luz talked about was nothing but an illusion. There's a strong negative reaction in this country. Exactly the opposite of what they wanted when they opened their border to us. That's why, Sophia, I expect them to rescind the order soon. So I said to myself, why don't we take advantage of the opportunity and go? When he looked at Sophia, she was trembling, and he saw her face become deathly pale as she fled from the room. He himself felt burning tears block his throat. From that point on, the name Kuldan had not stopped ringing in his head, exactly as it had 20 years ago, over and over above the surging throng at the port. It had to be the same for Sophia because they talked about everything throughout the trip, everything except Kuldan. Finally, nearing Bat Gaulim, they fell silent. Here they were, gazing silently at the road they both knew so well, its memory stuck fast in their heads like part of their very flesh and bones. As he used to do 20 years before, he slowed the car down to its lowest gear before reaching the curve that he knew concealed a difficult rocky surface behind it. He turned the car the way he always did and climbed the slope, watching out for the exact spot on the narrowing road. The 3 cypress trees that hung over the road had new branches. He wanted to stop a moment to read the names carved long ago on their trunks. He could almost remember them one by one. But he didn't stop. He didn't remember exactly how things had happened, but it started to come back to him when he passed a door he knew, where someone from the priest's family used to live. The priest's family owned a large building on South Stanton Street near Hallel Street. It was in that building, the day of the flight, that the Arab fighters barricaded themselves and fought to their last bullet and maybe their last man. He had passed that building when he was pushed toward the port by a force that surpassed his own strength. He remembered exactly that it was there and only there when the memory fell upon him like a blow from a rock. There, exactly, he had remembered Kuldan, and his heart had pounded that day 20 years ago and it continued pounding harder still today until it was nearly loud enough to be heard. Suddenly, the house loomed up, the very house he had first lived in, then kept alive in his memory for so long. Here it was again, its front balcony bearing its coat of yellow paint. Instantly he imagined that Sophia, young again with her hair in a long braid, was about to lean over the balcony toward him. There was a new clothesline attached to 2 pegs on the balcony, new bits of washing, red and white, hung on the line. Sophia began to cry audibly. He turned to the right and directed the car's wheels up over the low curb, then stopped the car in its old spot. Just like he used to do, exactly, 20 years ago. Said S, hesitated for just a moment as he let the engine die down. But he knew inside himself that if he hesitated for very long, it would end right there. He would start up the engine again and leave. So he made the whole thing appear, to himself, And to his wife, perfectly natural, as though the past 20 years had been put between two huge presses and crushed until they became a thin piece of transparent paper. He got out of the car and slammed the door behind him. He hitched up his belt and looked toward the balcony, absently jingling the keys in his palm. Sophia came around the car to his side, but she was not as composed as he was. He took her by the arm and crossed the street with her, the sidewalk, the green iron gate, the stairs. They began to climb, and he didn't give either of them the opportunity to see all the little things that would jolt and throw them off balance, the bell and the copper lock and the bullet holes in the wall and the electricity box and the fourth step broken in its center and the smooth carved balustrade which the palm slid over and the unyielding iron grillwork of the Mazadib, 0. And the first floor, where Majab Sadi lived, where the door was always ajar and the children always playing in front, filling the stairway with their shouts, past all of that and onto the recently painted wooden door, firmly closed. He put his fingers on the bell and said to Sophia quietly. They changed the bell. He was silent a moment, then added. And the name. Naturally. He forced a foolish smile onto his face and placed his hand over Sophia's. Her hand was cold and trembling. From behind the door they heard slow footsteps. An elderly person, no doubt, he said to himself. There was the muffled sound of a bolt creaking, and the door opened slowly. So this is she. He didn't know whether he said it out loud or to himself in the form of a deep sigh. He remained standing in the same place without knowing what he should do. He chided himself for not having prepared an opening sentence in spite of the fact that he had known with certainty that this very moment would arrive. He stirred himself and looked toward Sophia for help. Khalid 11 thereupon took a step forward and said, May we come in? The old woman didn't understand. She was short and rather plump and was dressed in a blue dress with white polka dots. As said began to translate into English, the lines of her face came together, questioning. She stepped aside, allowing Said and Sophia to enter, then led them into the living room. Said followed her, Sophia at his side, with slow, hesitant steps. They began to pick out the things around them with a certain bewilderment. The entrance seemed smaller than he had imagined it and felt a little damp. He saw many things he had once considered, and for that matter still considered, to be intimate and personal, things he believed were sacred and private property which no one had the right to become familiar with, to touch, or even to look at. A photograph of Jerusalem he remembered very clearly still hung where it had when he lived there. On the opposite wall a small Syrian carpet also remained where it had always hung. He looked around, rediscovering the items, sometimes little by little and sometimes all at once, like someone recovering from a long period of unconsciousness. When they reached the living room he saw 2 chairs from the set of 5 he used to own. The other 3 chairs were new, and they seemed crude and out of harmony with the rest of the furnishings. In the center of the room was the same inlaid table, although its color had faded a bit. The glass vase on top of the table had been replaced by a wooden one, and in it was a bunch of peacock feathers. He knew there used to be 7 of them. He tried to count them from where he was sitting, but he couldn't, so he got up, moved closer to the vase and counted them one by one. There were only 5. When he turned to go back to his seat, he saw that the curtains were different. The one Sophia had made 20 years ago from sugar-colored yarn had been taken down and replaced by curtains with long blue threads running through them. Then his gaze fell on Sophia and he saw that she seemed confused. She was examining the corners of the room as though counting up the things that were missing. The old woman was sitting in front of them on the arm of one of the chairs, looking at them with a blank smile on her face. Finally, without changing her smile, she said, "I have been expecting you for a long time." Her English was hesitant and marked by something like a German accent. She seemed to be pulling the words up out of a bottomless well as she pronounced them. Said leaned forward and asked her, "Do you know who we are?" She nodded several times to emphasize her certainty. She thought for a moment, choosing her words, then said slowly, "You are the owners of this house." "I know that." "How do you know?" Said and Sophia both asked the question simultaneously. The old woman continued to smile. Then she said, "From everything. From the photographs, from the way the two of you stood in front of the door. The truth is, ever since the war ended many people have come here, looking at the houses and going into them. Every day I said that surely you would come." At once she seemed to become confused and began to look around at the things distributed throughout the room as though she were seeing them for the first time. Involuntarily, Said followed her glance, moving his eyes from place to place as she moved hers. Sophia did the same. He said to himself, "How strange. 3 pairs of eyes looking at one thing, but how differently each see it." The old woman spoke then, more quietly now and even more slowly. "I'm sorry. But that's what happened. I never thought things would be the way they are now." Said smiled bitterly. He didn't know how he could say to her that he hadn't come for that, that he wouldn't get into a political discussion, that he knew she wasn't guilty of anything. She, not guilty of anything? No, not exactly. But how could he explain it to her? Sophia saved him the trouble, for she began to question the woman in a voice that seemed suspiciously innocent. Said. Translated. "Where did you come from?" "From Poland." "When?" 1948. "When exactly?" "March 1st, 1948. A heavy silence prevailed. All of them began to look around at things they had no need to look at. Said broke the silence, saying calmly, "Naturally we didn't come to tell you to get out of here. That would take a war." Sophia pressed his hand to keep him from veering away from the conversation, and he understood. He continued, trying to keep his words closer to the subject. "One mean, your presence here, in this house, our house. Sophia's and my house, is another matter. We only came to take a look at things, our things. Maybe you can understand that." She said quickly. "I understand, but..." Then he lost his composure. "Yes, but..." "This terrible, deadly, enduring, but..." He fell silent beneath the pressure of his wife's gaze. He felt he'd never be able to reach his goal. They were on a collision course here, it couldn't be denied. What was going on now was nothing more than absurd talk. For a moment he wanted to get up and leave. Nothing mattered to him anymore. Whether Caldoun was alive or dead made no difference. How things reached that point he simply couldn't say. He was filled with helpless, bitter anger, and felt as if he were about to explode inside. He didn't know how his gaze happened to fall upon the 5 peacock feathers stuck in the wooden vase in the middle of the room. He saw their rare, beautiful colors shifting in the puffs of wind coming from the open window. Pointing at the vase, he demanded gruffly. There were 7 feathers. What happened to the 2 missing feathers? The old woman looked where he was pointing, then looked at him again questioningly. He continued to hold his arm outstretched toward the vase, staring, demanding an answer. His entire universe hung in the balance, poised on the tip of her tongue. She rose from her chair and grasped the vase as though for the first time. Slowly she said, I don't know where the 2 feathers you speak of went. I can't remember. Maybe Dov played with them when he was a child and lost them. Dov. They said it together, said and Sophia. They stood up as if the earth had flung them up. They looked at her tensely, and she continued. Of course. Dov. I don't know what his name used to be. Nor if it even matters to you, but he looks a lot like you.